Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, this is Layman Pascal on the Integral Stages Love the System series, where we delve into policy, protocol, procedure, practices, and the principles of systemic intelligence. And one of the questions we often deal with is the relationship between individuals and the shared spirit of groups and the actual operational dynamics of organizations, especially when they're hoping to operate at a higher or deeper level. So joining me to delve into that stuff by sketching out her view of second-tier leadership, both as a managerial style and a life practice, is Daniela Bomatter. Hi, Daniela.
Hi, Layman. Good to be here.
I've got some specific things in mind to ask you, but I have like a general question, which is, what's the biggest change over the years in terms of what you feel like it takes to run and participate in effective, beneficial organizations? What do you know now that you didn't know 20 years ago?
I would say I am much more aware what the most important qualities of a good leader, good manager is. When you want to lead a team somewhere, what is helpful and what is probably not very helpful. And at the same time, I'm still a strong believer in leadership, and that's kind of also what compelled me to talk with you about the whole topic of leadership, because I feel like leadership has gotten a little bit a bad taste in some circles. It's almost like you don't talk about leadership because that sounds like hierarchy, and hierarchy is bad, and especially dominator hierarchy is totally bad. And I feel like we are a little bit stuck in that mindset of leadership not being respected anymore as what it is. And therefore, I feel strongly that we should hold up the flame for good leadership. And I hope we can go into the definition what I think good leadership could look like. And I would be very curious to hear your opinions about leadership and where you are at with this whole topic.
I'm curious about that myself because I feel ambivalent. I feel two different things. I have a lot of friends in the integral leadership community, and I respect what they're working on. And I know there needs to be a participatory ethic that helps people act with integrity, both for themselves and in their relationships and in their effect on groups in order to get things done the right way. But at the same time, part of me wonders, why are we calling that leadership? You know, doesn't leadership kind of attract the wrong kind of people? Maybe there's some other way to talk about it. So I have both these sides going on in me. So it's a very fertile area for inquiry, I think. How would you define leadership? How do you think about it generally?
One thing is, to respond to what you just said, leadership for me is not something we have to put out and say, I am the leader, you are the leader, or whatever. When I say I believe in leadership, it's actually not I believe in the label of leadership, right, but I believe in the thing itself. I believe in, let's put it like this, in some people being born to lead because they hold a big vision. And I love people who take responsibility for a big vision and then help others grow into this vision. And I'm very, very aware that this is kind of not green thinking, not kind of like flatland thinking, because very quickly the question comes up, what does that mean, a big vision? And the big vision is very dangerous because it could be the wrong vision. And I'm very aware of all of this. Yeah. And nevertheless, I haven't given up on the idea that some people could have a vision that it's worth standing behind, worth fighting for, worth standing up for. And for this to happen, my sense is that we need leaders. But then, and we can go into that, probably my second-tier leadership framework, or however we want to call it, has kind of 9 qualities I see in a leader that I find very important. And when we look into these qualities, they are all qualities that I actually think all of us, each and everybody of us, should develop. It's qualities I think, qualities of a good human being, or of a positive, forward-looking, creative, developmental human being. So leadership for me is not just the boss up there that tells everybody where to go. Obviously not. That's old thinking, but it has to do with a mindset of growth, of development, and of moving somewhere, having people align behind a shared direction, and then find out together how to go there, what needs to happen to take these steps towards. Like, when we look into the world, there are so many big problems and big challenges, where I think it would be absolutely amazing if there would pop up some leaders in some areas that would gather people behind them and would lead them into a good direction. Climate change, where are the big climate change leaders? Where are the people that actually can initiate change and real new thinking? So, and same in the integral movement. You know that I'm close to the integral movement, obviously, and I miss the leaders there.
Yeah. It seems like we have this notion of green, pluralistic, postmodern, egalitarian, anti-hierarchical, and it does a beautiful job of looking back at the previous stages of development and critiquing them. Mm-hmm. But it sometimes doesn't let people go forward to what's beyond that. And yet there are things in that level of consciousness that should be very amenable to leadership, right? If you talk to people who are progressive, they love Gandhi, they love Martin Luther King. There are a lot of leaders they respect. And I think your point about believing in leadership as the phenomenon, not as the label, is important, because I think when we look back with a critical eye, we very often see, turns out the emperor had no clothes. A lot of people who were official leaders were not actually leading us. And very often the real leader was the person who said, hey, that official leader isn't really a leader at all. We should not be doing what he or she told us to do. And now that person is manifesting the leadership qualities rather than having the leadership position officially. I think Green can understand that very well, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, when you look at people like Mandela, which is one of such a famous example of a leader. I mean, what made him this amazing leader? Being in prison for how long was it? 30 years? I mean, this is such an amazing story, and he had this quality of a leader before he went into prison, and definitely afterwards. And it's almost like a position to life that a leader shows, and that has the transmission and the power to inspire other people to live up to their best. That's one of the qualities that I strongly feel is important for a leader, like to uplift other people and in the end align them behind the vision. I think that this, like, one of these qualities that I'm focused on is focus. A leader, I think, is focused on a probably even utopian vision or utopian goal, far out. It can be far out, it can be close, whatever. In an organization it's probably close, but it can also be far out. But it provides directionality. It's like this, instead of spreading out far, it provides this directionality that is kind of needed to take the steps towards a certain goal or towards a certain vision.
So now, focus is the first of the 9 qualities that you listed on the website that I had a look at. And it was phrased very much in terms of conscious intention. And it made me curious what you think about the role of subconscious intention. Do you think people can be sort of instinctively good leaders and help organize people towards beneficial and deep outcomes without necessarily having a conscious vision, without necessarily having something that they know they're working on? Maybe it's just their nature instinctively to be able to do that.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think my answer is yes. I believe that this is possible in a leader, because I see where you're pointing to. It's not necessary that you have this kind of written down goal, like as a vision. It's, when I say focus, it's, yeah, you could say subconscious focus. That's an interesting term. Or directionality, like this. We will see it in other qualities that I have listed. For me, it has a lot to do. Obviously, you know that I'm a student of Andrew Cohen, and his Evolutionary Enlightenment teaching has this term of the authentic self that is aligned with the evolutionary impulse that is driving the creative process. So when we take that into account and bring it together with leadership, then a leader is actually somebody that is aligned to this process that is moving forward, and is intuitively, as you say, connected to something bigger, to a higher vision, probably a vision that is not even easy to put on paper. And yeah, I can totally see that.
So if I'm remembering correctly, the second quality is creativity.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether you think, in terms of second tier leadership, is creativity just a natural feature of people at second tier, or is it something we can actively try to work on in ourselves? Is it a spontaneous phenomenon, or is it a practice?
Yeah, I think in second tier, it is a spontaneous phenomenon. I think it comes with second tier. I would say that in first tier, like an orange leader, there are good orange leaders. I'm not saying at all that only second tier can kind of create this excellent leaders. In orange, with somebody that has center of gravity in orange, I think creativity needs to be trained more, or needs to be consciously embraced. Whereas in second tier, I would say from teal and turquoise anyway, you would automatically be connected to creativity, because it comes with the dynamic and the agility that comes with second tier, and also with a multi-perspectival view that is far bigger than you see it in first tier. So you kind of have to be creative to manage all these different aspects.
Do you feel like you are more spontaneously creative than you were in your youth?
Yeah, I think I am. And I also think this is still not my strength. I actually still think that's something that I would like to develop more. I always was in my career, I always was, when you know about this distinction between managers and leaders, like the leader is more the visionary, and the manager is more the one that actually makes it happen. And I always had a leaning towards the managerial side, like being somebody that can make things happen. And I never thought of myself as the big visionary, and that I feel is connected to the creativity. I think the real visionaries, they are creative from their being, from their whole being. And I would love to have a little bit more of that.
You know, when I went through that list of qualities, I noticed there were several quotes from Wayne Carr.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask what it is that you appreciate so much about his insights or his phrasing. Like, why is Wayne Carr in there several times?
Because he wrote the piece about second tier leadership that I found the most impressive. And I don't know him, by the way. Do you know him personally, or
Not
of
personally,
him,
no.
or have you talked to him?
Just-
It's literally just, I found that he has worded something that I have intuited in such a beautiful way that I was just blown away. So I thought, instead of trying to rephrase it in my Swiss English, I can rather quote him and give him the credit for some beautiful sentences.
So if I'm still remembering correctly, the next quality was empowering and empowered.
Yep.
And there's a lot of people that have a pretty negative view of power, and I usually assume that they're thinking of it too narrowly. right? They're thinking of certain forms of power seeking and not of power in general.
Yep.
But what do you think of when you think of power? What is the phenomenon of power such that a person could be more empowered and also empower others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I have thought a lot about that, and I consciously chose to use these words, even though knowing that they trigger many people. But for me, being empowered means, like, let's talk very concretely in an organizational context. So one of the organizational models that I really love, and that is also part of how holacracy works, which is one of the organizational models that is considered a second-tier model, is that you define roles, clear roles that somebody has in an organization, and then you assign people you feel are competent to fill this role, and you give them full power over their role. So it's not power to do everything with everybody, but the empowerment of somebody in his or her role, I find extremely important. So if you define a marketing leadership role in your organization, and then you look for the best marketing guy you can find, then you have to trust him. That also leads to another quality, trust and being trustworthy. These two are kind of connected for me, the empowering and empowered, and trust and trustworthy, because you can only empower somebody that you trust. So empowering means you trust him so much that you say, this is your department. Do what you think is the right thing to do. And we just align in the direction, in the vision where we want to go. So you communicate together, you ask each other questions, you are in dialogue. But when it comes to the final decision, and this is a hard one, you let the marketing guy decide his marketing stuff, and you let the HR guy decide about HR stuff, and you let the sales guy decide about sales stuff. Whereas the old CEO or the old leader in the hierarchical organizations kind of always wanted to have the last word. Mm-hmm. And I see the future of organizations, and to be very, very honest, I haven't seen it yet. Let's put it like this. This for me is still theory, and I would be very curious if anybody has seen it, like that you really can create an organization where the responsible people for certain roles are fully empowered and can do what they need to do in their job, and everybody trusts them, and this is how the organization moves forward. It's very challenging, it's very hard to do, and that has to do with the fact that not many people are actually able and willing to take that kind of responsibility. That's another thing we can talk about when we talk about leadership. I do believe that most people actually like to be led. Many of those wouldn't admit it. It's more like, this is kind of a contradiction, but I actually think most people that are working in organizations and also in their normal lives like to be led by somebody and look up to somebody. And postmodernity has kind of killed that, like officially killed, but unofficially, I think people still do it. They look up to the health gurus and the workout gurus and all kind of specialist people that they trust and they want to kind of listen to. So it's a tricky thing with leadership. How many people really want to take that responsibility on and be fully responsible for what they are doing?
I think it's an interesting area because the way I imagine it is it's sort of people have different tempos, right? Like a lot of people might like to lead 5% of the time and be led 95% of the time. And other people might like to lead 40% of the time and be led 60% of the time. And nobody wants to be led too much when they feel like it's their time to lead, but nobody wants to necessarily have to be the leader for everybody all the time. So getting those balances correct seems like it's the important thing, because I think a lot of the anti-leadership sentiment has come from leaders who didn't understand that followers don't always want to follow, or don't always want to follow in the same way. That they sometimes have to be leaders, and you have to figure out when that is to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting. We have discussed a lot about this also in Manifest Nirvana, because also in a spiritual context with a guru, with a teacher, you have exactly the same discussions. Obviously, this is also about leadership. I mean,
Sure.
this is full on. And what I found very helpful, the way I find very helpful to think about is when you imagine a verticality, a hierarchy of depth or skill set or knowledge or leadership, just like think of an organization or a community or whatever you do as a hierarchy. And then inside the hierarchy, every single person is sometimes in the leadership role because she or he is helping somebody else to see deeper, more broader in a certain topic. Another time, she or he is in a peer role and engages with peers, which is often the most challenging engagement because there is a lot of tension when you engage on a peer level. And then in other times, you have somebody to look up, where you learn from, where you feel the developmental pull upward, this hierarchy. And when you then see each and everybody embedded in such a structure where, as you say, the roles actually change continuously, depending on the topic that is to be discussed. Like, for example, the hierarchy in a spiritual organization is different when it comes to spiritual depths than it is when it comes to earning money. So you wanna honor that, and the same is true in every organization. It really depends what the topic is, where the highest skill set is, and if you can create an organization that Andrew Cohen calls this natural hierarchy, establishes a natural hierarchy which means nothing else than see where is the highest wisdom in this specific question, and then follow that hierarchy. And that person is then, for that moment or the next moments, the leader in that question. And everybody recognizes it and accepts it and follows that wisdom because it's obvious that he or she has a higher knowledge. Then you create a beautiful structure where hierarchies can dynamically change, and everybody, that's what I said at the beginning, everybody is living this leadership role whenever it is appropriate, because you have the highest wisdom or the highest knowledge or the highest skills in a topic.
I think one of the way I think about it, the shift to a higher form of leadership often involves shifting the question of what to the question of who. Right. So who is the person who's going to hold the leadership context on this topic or in this space? But also, how do we come to a decision about who's worth trusting in a given circumstance? I heard a very interesting political answer to a question about abortion in the last American election. And they were trying to say, when do you decide? When is it inappropriate to terminate? And the answer was, it's not really about when. It's always going to be a very difficult decision. It's a question of who gets to make that difficult decision. Should it be the government? Should it be the mother? Right. So this shift to who is really interesting. There's a historian, Niall Ferguson, who wrote an interesting book saying that more regulation creates more inequality and corruption because only the wealthy and powerful have the resources to hire the people to figure out how to get around the regulations. So if you want to have a non-corrupt system, you need fewer regulations. And in order to counterbalance that, you need to empower regulators more to make unregulated decisions. But then you have to figure out, who do I trust? Who's a competent regulator? And we don't have a history of making really good decisions about people in our society. Now, integral theory and things analogous to integral theory give us some tools. we might say, well, in the future, a multi-line, multi-stage assessment of people could really help us understand if someone's competent or not. But at the moment, it's very difficult. We know that, you could have a really good president, and if they hire the wrong team, they won't have a very good presidency. So it seems to me that one of the key things that leaders in the future need to be able to do is to assess other people really well, to figure out who should be trusted.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I try to catch up with you on that the who is more important than the what, because the way I think about, I totally agree with everything that you just said. But then my sense is, before you even can assess people, you need to know what are you assessing them against. And for that, you need to have the what, and that's what I call the roles. You have to define the role. What is this regulator meant to decide about? Let's put it like this. What is this job meant to do? And the better that role description, the better I think you can assess the people against that description of what is actually expected, because people can be good in one area of life, very good, excellent, and complete failures in others. So if you don't know what you want to give them and what you want to entrust them,
I think that's very correct. I'm emphasizing the who because I think it's been underemphasized, but it's who for what.
For what exactly? Exactly. No, that's perfect. It's who for what. And then the who, and then we are back to who is actually able and willing to take that responsibility. The who then has to want to take that responsibility. Because in a way, the example you brought, for that regulator, it takes he has to take much more responsibility when he has less regulation, because then it's him having to take the decision. That exposes him much more. And it takes a brave person to do that.
There's a lot of spiritual qualities that come into play here, because self-knowledge and risk-taking are really important in both sides, because a person has to take the risk of taking responsibility for a role, but there's always somebody else who has to take the risk of allowing that person to really control that role and keeping themselves in check so that they don't micromanage and undermine that person's authority in that role.
Exactly. And I have tried that in my own life as a CEO. I have really tried hard to empower people, and often it has worked, but also in quite a few cases I had to kind of step back, and I wasn't able to continue to trust somebody and had to intervene, and because it just didn't work. That's the tricky thing, that this is only theory as long as you don't find the right people for these roles. And I still think that's the biggest challenge before anything else, that people are actually in their own self-development at a point, as you say, where they are capable and able and willing to take responsibility for what they are given. Also take responsibility to co-create, because so many people say, yeah, we need to create co-creative environments now where we all contribute and where we all make sure that it goes in the right direction, that the right decisions are taken. But how many people are actually able to do so? I question that, and I'm probably a little bit over pessimistic in that sense, but I just see too many people that want to be followers and don't want to be leaders, not even leaders of their own lives.
It reminds me of dog training, right? Not to belittle anyone, but there are shows where people are professional dog trainers who help out people who have pets. And when they go to the house of the pet and the pet is unhappy, the pet is stressed, the pet is acting out, it almost always turns out that the human is pretending the dog is not a dog. They're not communicating any kind of pack hierarchy instructions. They're not leading that dog. And that just creates confusion and anxiety, right? And it's not suppressive of the dog. It's respectful because it takes the dog's social needs into account as part of its well-being.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that leads us right away to developmental theory, that we actually, and that's another quality of the leader that I see, this inclusiveness, in the sense that you wanna get people where they are at, and from what level of consciousness of development they are acting, what are their value systems, what is driving them. And you can only lead people when you have a good understanding of what values they come from. I'm living in India right now, and that's just so interesting to see what that means when you are in a totally different culture that is much more still leaning into in the traditional modern developmental stage, and how different people act and react and respond to situations. And that's the same in an organization. You need to get a sense for how your team is put together and what drives them. And I find that one of the most difficult leadership qualities is you need to learn the language to talk to different developmental stages. And that's incredibly difficult.
So the next of your 9 qualities, I think, is authenticity. And that's a really complicated one in my view, because there's, postmodernism has brought forward the ideal of authenticity, partly because it's critiqued conventional notions of merit and authority and found that there's been a lot of problems there. So you have to look for something else that gives you integrity and gravitas other than having a rank or a badge or something like that. Yeah. So we advocate authenticity, but often in a very superficial and shallow manner, which is sort of, we end up advocating self-indulgence and indifference to other people. So there's that problem. There's the problem of being overly attracted to people who seem charismatic because they're good at pretending to be authentic. And then there's the problem of, in a developmental sense, someone can be more authentic at a lower level, and someone else can be more sophisticated, but not as authentic at that level. And how do we adjudicate who we need in a given team if the simpler, less deep person is a more authentic version of themselves, and the more sophisticated person we'd love them to be more authentic, but maybe they aren't. So what's your overall feeling about the conundrum, the swamp of authenticity?
No, it's such a good question and so multifaceted. So one thing is, there is no one definition of authenticity, obviously, and I can completely relate to postmodernity that kind of puts out this authenticity that I would define it as ego authenticity, like this right to put out whatever I feel right now in this moment and let you know that I'm happy or absolutely unhappy about what you just said to me. And like this kind of authenticity that kind of spills out everything and feels like this is my right and you have to know that. But that's definitely not what I am pointing to. And for me, true authenticity is a spiritual developmental matter. Like true authenticity comes from a deep groundedness in, call it spirit, call it awakening, call it connection to again this evolutionary impulse to God. We can call it however we want to call it, but it has to do with depths. When you meet somebody that comes from the depths of his being and then expresses him or herself, that is what I perceive as real authenticity. when you don't have the feeling, oh, there are layers and layers of cover and I don't see really through it. I don't get to the bottom of that person. And I just think for a leader, this is essential, because you cannot lead when you have covers over who you really are. You have to be transparent and open and authentic in how you present yourself and how you act towards your team members or towards everybody.
That requires a fairly high degree of self-knowledge, right? Which, I mean, there's a problem with all the stages, which is you seldom get a complete, healthy, balanced version of a stage.
No.
Right? But if we had a healthy, balanced version of green, it would not only involve, ecology and critique and a kind of progressive politics. It would involve this other part, which is the pluralistic deconstruction of the psyche, which is the psychological realization that we have these different systems and these different voices, some conscious, some unconscious, competing in ourselves. And if we're aware that we have thoughts and we have feelings and we have sensations and we have conscious and unconscious, that we have these many voices, then I think we're in a position to start to be more authentic in the second tier sense. That's the minimum. Once you have that, you can start to work with it and bring those together and know about them. But all of the previous tiers sort of pretend that our social personality already takes all of that into account. And I just am who I am. And you have to go, well, I'm not necessarily just who I am. I'm all these things. And if I don't know about those things, I can't really show up very authentically with others.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, I would like to add the awakening dimension, to kind of quote the Wilbur Combs matrix or lattice. I find it very important to keep this distinction that Ken so beautifully makes between the growing up and the waking up in mind. And for me, real authenticity comes with awakening, comes with the state of, how Andrew Cohen calls it, the authentic self, which has authentic in the name, but it's the state experience of awakened mind that falls on the structure stage, that a human being has its center of gravity. And when we think about second tier leadership, when we think an awakened mind, awakening can fall on a teal or a turquoise leader, that's a different person than somebody that isn't able to connect to these states and is only focused on the structure. So I strongly believe that needs to come together. And
I think we'll end up seeing second tier communities specialize, where some of them are more comfortable bringing together, psychological systems, conscious and unconscious, and other ones will be more comfortable also bringing together the states. So that some will be more of a spiritual leadership process, but we'll be able to understand and resonate with people who've specialized in more psychological and sociological versions of the phenomenon. Even though ultimately our map of the things we need to integrate should include all of that stuff.
Exactly.
Everybody's going to work on something a little more than something else.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it's literally impossible to cover all of it in kind of one organization or one movement or however we want to call it. But my understanding of the authenticity that I have in mind here is an understanding that has to do with a certain level of awakening, whatever that means. We could talk hours about what that really means. What does awakening mean? What does enlightenment mean? But it has to do with the states that can be accessed and that make somebody more authentic than when you don't have that.
Yeah, and I think the evolutionary context is a huge part of understanding that, because I think we can, the way I view it is typically that we can bring lots of dimensions of ourselves together, and if we can get coherence among many dimensions of ourselves, then we bring forward something that exceeds our identity, exceeds our map of the world even. And it gives us an energy we wouldn't otherwise have. It gives us a confidence and a faithfulness. And some people could get that by bringing together, some social and psychological things. And other people can get that by bringing together some state change things. But ultimately, the more we bring together, the more we get of that phenomenon. And without that, we're not moving forward. We need something in ourselves that exceeds who we are in order to take a next step. Otherwise, we end up being leaders who are just stuck in our identity. And in an evolutionary sense of leadership, we always have to be going past our identity somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very important point, because the leader is also somebody that is always willing to let go of what is and see what is the next right step, that is always willing to embrace change. And as you say, not be stuck in what is. That's a big part of true leadership, because we live in a developmental context and everything is going much faster all the time. We have seen that over the last decades. And a leader that cannot adapt quickly and take his and her team with him and her, it's just not working. You cannot be stuck in whatever you do. Therefore, holacracy has this beautiful term of dynamic steering that I always loved a lot, like this, always looking what is the situation, and then you steer. It's totally different than the old managerial systems that kind of had this 5 or 10 year plans, and everything that happens was aligned to a 5 or 10 year plan. You cannot even imagine this nowadays, that a leader or a manager could do that, because it's just not how the world ticks. You have to constantly adapt, and that takes a lot.
Steve McIntosh and I have argued a few times historically about whether or not there's actually a lower right quadrant and a virtue that goes along with that quadrant.
Ooh.
And he sometimes thinks you could get away with the big 3. And I'm pretty strongly in favor of the fact that you need 4, and that it's in Plato and Socrates. It's not just the good, the true, and the beautiful. There's also justice. And justice isn't the same as how we all feel about whether something was just or unjust. Yeah. Because when Socrates describes justice, he gives 2 examples. And one example is the classes of society are arranged in the correct order. And the other example is he calls them souls. They're arranged in the correct order. So for him, justice means having things organized correctly.
That's
I think
interesting.
that's really important. And the fact that he gives an interior and an exterior view of how to do that has always interested me. And I'm seeing something similar to that here, because if authenticity is a kind of inclusion of a lot of our different parts and states, you have this other quality of inclusiveness, but it's sort of, how do we include the types of people and the levels of people outside of ourselves? How does a leader do that? Right.
Exactly.
You also mentioned the communication problem, is you have to be able to speak many languages.
Yep.
There's also a problem about our motivation, because part of us wants to be able to really be there and include as many types of people at as many stages as possible. But another part of us wants to focus as much as we can on the deepest people that we can focus on and be surrounded by them. So how does a leader juggle those 2 things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that really depends on what you're leading, because if you are leading a leading edge, new thought movement, then you probably just want to go with the deepest people that you can find, and the people that are the most aligned with your vision, because everything else would just not work. But if you lead an organization that produces things, whatever the things are, then you'd better integrate the right people for the right jobs, and that can go up and down the spiral. And still, you have to be very aware then how you talk to different people and what different people need, also in terms of leadership. That's probably another aspect. As I said before, I don't think that all people don't want to be led, or that I think most people want to be led. And in some of the green organizations, there was this idea that now everybody has the same saying and everything is democratic. And I've never seen it really work, because the skill level is not the same. Not all people are capable to contribute to important decisions. And I don't even think this should be the goal. We should include people according to their readiness to be included. And I'm aware that's a tricky thing, who defines who is ready and who is not ready. This is all very complex. I'm not naive. And still, I do think there is something in being very aware what kind of people you are working with. I mean, here in India, the nice cleaning lady that comes every few days and cleans the house, she has different needs, how I talk to her and what I tell her, where she has to clean and how exactly she has to clean. Not because I want to make her smaller than she is, but that's just who she is and what she understands. And I think we have to honor that. I find it more important to honor that than to do as if she would understand the same language as you understand when I talk with you. That wouldn't be right. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost something abusive about it in a way. Like when I think about, one of the definitions of trauma is just something happening before you're ready to be able to process it. Right. And that's one of the classic, like, why is sexual abuse a form of abuse? Right. It's because it happens too soon, usually. Even if the person felt like they were a voluntary participant, we still regard it as traumatic because they're not ready to handle that. And likewise, there's forms of thinking and forms of speech that if you're not ready for it, it's at least irritating and possibly disruptive of your own growth.
Yeah, exactly. And that needs to be respected in all contexts. And that's something that the leader has to do, and that's part of his trustworthiness. I want a leader where I can trust that he is capable of finding the right words to the right people, of being appropriate in how he involves people, who he involves. I don't want a leader in any context that would involve people in decision-making processes where I feel like, but that's not, they can't do that. They don't have the capacity to do that. That wouldn't be helpful.
So the next quality is facing what is, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? Like not looking away from something because it makes us uncomfortable. And
exactly.
That's really important, but it's also tricky because a lot of avoidance happens before we even notice. I had this very lovely conversation with Andrew last week, and Andrew's for a long time had this ethic of facing everything, including things that make us uncomfortable. But he looks back on some of his career and realizes there were things that he didn't even notice that he had to face.
Absolutely.
So if we go, oh, this is uncomfortable and I should face it, that's one thing, but it might not even stand out to me. The avoidance might have happened before I even noticed. So how do we face what is when our internal mechanism for avoiding things goes on before we even notice so much of the time?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I want to take one step back before we go into this very subtle question that you are asking, and you are right in that. But my point, bringing this in as a leadership quality, is actually a very simple one. If everybody, and I told you I see kind of everybody as having these leadership qualities or being able to develop these leadership qualities, would at least face the things we see and act accordingly and not look away.
Start.
That would be a good starting point. Would you agree? Before we go into the unconscious, because and this is really a very practical thing I got from my managerial career. I think I was successful because I had this quality very heavily, and that looks I want to give a very pragmatic example, because this is really not esoteric, an esoteric quality. It's a very real quality. For example, you can sit in a meeting with 10 people, and the shyest person in the room says one sentence about the problem that she thinks we have. Now, and it's a demanding project. A lot of things are happening, and the last thing you need is one more problem. Yeah. So now it makes all the difference if you have the capacity to listen to that shy voice of somebody that you respect, but she isn't confident, she isn't loud, she isn't shouting it in your face. She is just making the point that she feels there is a problem somewhere in the corner. And then the leadership quality that I address here is the quality to not look away, to not ignore it until in 2 weeks another guy is shouting the same point at you and it's too late by then, or costs too much to fix it. And this is true for all kinds of things that come up in very heavy, difficult projects, where you always have these situations that things go wrong. And either you catch it right at the beginning. This for me is also facing everything. And you catch it, you do something with it, or you look away until it explodes onto your whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a line in the Tao Te Ching which says the sage does great things while they are still small.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah.
There's so much in what you just said that, I'm thinking of this shy person, and I think there's not only the problem of the shy person, there's the problem of how people relate to the loud person as well. Like I'm thinking of when I was in school, there would be some classes and they would go, oh, we're going to have a special class for the people who do well. And often it's the kids who really did the best were the most quiet because they didn't want to answer simple questions. And some of the kids who were the least bright kids in the bright class always had their hand up to answer the question, and the brightest kids were always like, why are you even answering that? Isn't that obvious? That kind of thing. So they were self-censoring, not out of shyness, but out of a higher standard. So there's lots of reasons why you might want to do the extra work of trying to include the person who's not shouting their information at you.
Yeah, exactly. And then this, as you say, is in the end a cultural thing. So that leads us back to the leader also being the one that is helping to define the culture, because you want to create a culture where the shy person dares to say something as a shy person. And that is not the case everywhere. That is absolutely not the case everywhere. I'm just trying to remember that book about the developmental organization. I'm sure you know the book. It's a famous one of an organization that cultivates this openness and transparency, even with every single error that happens. They have an intranet where everybody that made a mistake has to document it on the intranet and tell everybody what he or she next time would do differently. So it's an amazing way of leading an organization and creating a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, where it's okay to say something, and all under this umbrella of facing everything and avoiding nothing. Actually want to have the full truth on the table to be able to take the right decision.
I think that shift is absolutely huge.
It's in developmental organization.
Yeah. Holacracy has this strategy around facilitating tensions, and there's a whole notion that's come out of Silicon Valley around sort of failing faster. And I think there's a change in terms of how we value mistakes. The mistakes are really useful, and the tensions are really useful. And I think that's essential for second tier work of any kind. Because if we are going to integrate different aspects of ourselves, we have to be able to occupy the space between different perspectives. And that comes up as cognitive dissonance, right? That most of us, our natural response is to feel uncomfortable and threatened when we can't choose a perspective. And so we double down on one of them or we exit the situation. But in order to combine perspectives, we have to stand between them, which will feel uncomfortable, will feel like a failure to pick the right one, will feel like a tension or an aggravation. So that's a kind of self-management, self-awareness skill. And we have to feel good enough to be willing to spend time in that uncomfortable space, whether it's the space of, I don't really know the answer, or it's the space of, I'm going to do the extra work to listen to a person who hasn't been telling me anything yet. All right. So there's a huge, the ability to dwell in the space of cognitive dissonance, I think, is essential to this.
Absolutely. Or it's also the space of admitting that yes, what I said yesterday was actually wrong.
That's right.
And I changed my mind today. This takes a lot. Yeah. And isn't it also true that all of this is inhibited by the ego, by our frontal self that wants to keep control of how we are being seen? And when we like admitting mistakes, changing our minds, admitting that we were wrong, this is all only a problem from our small self that wants to keep up the image of ourselves. But it's not a problem for the authentic self, or what we call the authentic self, for the free self that can easily say, okay, yesterday I thought this was the right answer to this question, but I actually see now that it was not.
That's
or as you said,
area.
holding this situations where you just don't know yet what to do and where to go.
It's another area in my mind where good, solid, healthy green would be so helpful because of, all those things that arose in the West in the 1960s in terms of chemicals that change your mind, in terms of trying to relax and not be as uptight and reactive about things, and listening to more diverse perspectives, and all those skills that what Timothy Leary called dropping out is in many ways dropping out of that need to control how you're being perceived as correct. And yet we've lost a lot of that real juiciness that green has to offer us. And without those skills being generated, we're not in a very good position to move forward into greater degrees of development and integration.
That's a very interesting point. It's interesting that you're saying that, because I just had a discussion today about my green allergy that is still not completely healed, and I'm getting aware that I should work on healing my green allergy, but there is also a lot of resistance. But you just gave me a beautiful argument why of beautiful healthy green. That's cool.
The next quality was listening, and what I really liked in how it was written up on the website was listening to the words, but also to the spaces, and that's very important to me personally. And I've got here's a weird anecdote, which is I never listened to a lot of popular music when I was a kid. So very often I would hear things go, oh, that's good. And people would say, yeah, it's always, that's Led Zeppelin. Don't you know Led Zeppelin? I'm like, what are you talking about? So one day I decided, all right, I'm going to try to figure out what this Led Zeppelin thing is. And I just got a lot of their music and I read about them for a couple of months. I tried to get into it and I would play it and I wasn't sure what to do. And there was I was at a friend's house. I had one song on and I realized if I stopped listening to the notes and started listening to the space between the notes, I sort of fell inside the song. And I'm like, oh, I get it now. I see what was happening with these people in the culture and in everyone's minds. So that little shift to validating the spaces was enormously practical for me in coming to appreciate part of what's going on in the world.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, I do think the listening skill is probably one of the most important, and it has a lot to do with what we just spoke about, this being able to let go of past experiences and knowledge, and like, because true deep listening is actually always happening in the now and tries to not come from a place of already knowing, either the answer or the solution, but real listening. If you're serious in listening to a team member, or in a meeting to all the team members, and we really listen, then we have to suspend our own opinions about it, and also our past experiences, and that it hasn't worked last time, and why it wouldn't work this time, and all of this, and you really want to listen deeply. And it's almost like a meditative practice, because you want to locate yourself in the present moment with everything else gone, and just deeply listen. And there are different things that happen then. One thing is you are the most receptive that you can be. And as you just pointed to, these gaps in between are opening up a space to intuition, or to something that is beyond us, to put it in a little bit spiritual or esoteric terms, that often can catalyze real new ideas and real creativity, and a spark of newness that can catapult a whole team into a different space. I have a little anecdote that was very impressive to me in that respect. I was in a strategy meeting in one of the companies I was on the board, and we had a kind of a 2-day strategy meeting. And these are these meetings where you try to look into the future and next years, and what you want to do and where you want to go. And it was the end of the first day, or the beginning of the second, and we were literally stuck. Nothing has come out. We didn't really know how to move. And there were walls and walls full of written boards and things, and it was chaotic, but not leading to anything. And then that morning, I went to a board, took everything down, had a white paper there, and I said only one sentence, and I said, let's just start at 0 again. And then my colleagues, like 6 colleagues were in this meeting with me. They looked at me as I was crazy, because we had worked for it full day. And I insisted, I didn't say anything more. I started with a little circle in the middle of that white paper and said, let's just start again. Let's just come up with new ideas and start again. And then we went into a 2-hour brainstorming session where it came out of everybody from that 0 point. It was like magic. And I'm a strong believer in coming from 0 as the catalyzer of newness and creativity.
One thing that comes up for me is the role that genuine curiosity plays in listening, because I do a lot of these conversations and recordings and interviews with people, and I seem to be able to listen to them fairly well. But on the other hand, I talk to somebody in my life and they start telling me about their cousin, and I just drift right out, or I have to make an effort to pay attention.
Yeah.
When I ask questions that I actually want to know the answer to, then it's very easy to listen.
No, that's true. That's totally true. And it's also when you actually have a real question, no? When you don't think you know the answer already, then it's easiest to listen. When you actually are interested, and when you have the curiosity to either know the other person's perspective, even when you have your own, or if you really don't know and you want to know, and you really lean into the question. And when you do that in a group, when we also do dialogue work in Manifest Nirvana, where this is a practice, like this talking from the source, from this place of deep listening as the beginning point, this place where I'm more interested in what I don't know yet than what I know already. And that creates a vortex of inspiration and shared excitement of the possible, of this leaning into the future and leaning into what is possible. That is an absolutely beautiful collective spiritual practice.
So the last of the 9 qualities is trust and trustworthiness. And we've talked a little bit about trusting people, but I think you say something about it in terms of a leader trusting the life process in general. And that's a very interesting thing, because there's a delicate balance there between I trust life in general, but I also have to be vigilant and not trust any given person or any given life process too much, because it could easily be trying to cheat me or eat me or something like that. So how do we balance having a general trust with also being alert enough not to be fooled by things that are actually dangerous?
Yeah, we really have to make this distinction. And for me, this trusting in the life process is really a quality that comes with 2nd-Tier, because I do think that in 2nd-Tier we actually awaken to this process perspective, to evolution, to the developmental process that we are all part of. And I strongly believe that this process is driven by something, somebody, an energy. We can call it however we want to call it, but I do think that there's an underlying source that drives this process. And when I say trust the life process, I mean trust this underlying process that is, in my opinion and my experience, inherently good. Now, this is the biggest context. And then inside of that deep trust in life that guides you as a person and in what you're doing, we have to make all the necessary distinctions and discernments that help us to take the right decisions in the relative world. It's almost like this trust in the life process for me is an absolute dimension. It's a trust in the absolute goodness of the whole thing that is moving forward. Whereas then in our relative existence and in the projects or organizations or situations we are in the relative context, and there we need to discern and distinguish, and we need to find out what is right or wrong. We need to take decisions, and we cannot blindly trust in anybody or anything. The trust in life for me is like a deep soul level trust. And I sometimes think you either have that or you don't. I wonder if it really can be developed.
I'm thinking of a story that Chogyam Trungpa told about intrinsic goodness. And he told a story about 2 bandits who were out at night and they were on their way to kill someone. And they're riding in the dark, and one of them sees the moon and says, "Oh, look at the moon." And the other one looks. Right. So Trungpa's point was it's this feeling that there's a basic beauty and perfection is in even the worst person.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Why 9? Is it arbitrary? If you had to add one more, what would you add?
I'm sure there are a lot that could be added. 9 is because 9 is my number. I like the number 9. Sure. Kind of my lucky number. It's a number that I like. And I haven't thought about it. I feel like the 9 are giving such a full spectrum of things we could develop and can talk about and think about, that and we could add another 9 and that would be as full as this 9. It's, yeah, no specific reason and no claim that this is the total of leadership capacities or anything, but it's pretty good to work with.
One of the things that came up for me several times in terms of going through this list was risk taking and playfulness, and maybe a sort of indifference to public opinion. That these, right, not like we want to ignore everyone, because it's very important for a leader to take people seriously, especially in terms of the feedback they're giving you about themselves. But there are, whether it's Elon Musk or Joe Rogan, or there's people that seem to have leadership potential because they are playful, because they take risks, because they're willing to do things that someone else might not do because they don't want to be upsetting, or they don't want to violate a contemporary social norm. And it seems like in order to occupy the space of leadership, you have to be willing to challenge the implicit taboos or anxieties that most of the culture is laboring under at any given moment.
I love it. And I wonder, and I want to ask the question back to you, if this is most probably comes with the authenticity, how I understand authenticity. I cannot imagine that when you are really authentic, you wouldn't do what you just beautifully described. Because when you are authentically you and stand for what you believe in and stand for what you believe to be true, then you cannot compromise, no? Or not compromise when it doesn't make sense. Sometimes we do have to make compromises. I'm not saying we never compromise, but then you stand up for what you know to be true and of value, and would take these risks that come with it.
I think you probably could fit that into authenticity, especially in terms of, like we were discussing, the ego that tries to protect its impression that it's making on others. Yeah. And I think if we can understand the difference between what that entity is and what our authentic self is, then we will start to favor things, even if they are disruptive to that thing.
Exactly.
Even if they don't save face.
Yep. Yeah. That's totally true. But let me ask a question back to you that I wanted to cover in our conversation today. Do you think that leadership is valued enough nowadays? Like, is it the quality that people would, like in 2nd-Tier, in the integral meta-modern movement, would you say that leadership is valued enough, or is there room for improvement, that we re-embrace leadership in a good way, in a positive way, like in a way I felt we were talking very positively about leadership today. And in that sense, I do think there is a vacuum of leaders that would actually be willing and able to take these roles and not shy away from it, even from talking about it.
I think there is room for a new kind of leadership to assume a more important role. I don't know that it necessarily has to be called leadership, but I don't think we should shy away from terms just because we're suspicious of them. I think we see a lot of people who have leadership potential in the community, and it would be nice if there was a shared mood that encouraged them to go further with that.
Yep, exactly.
And I think we're all becoming more sober about the scale and tempo of the challenges we're collectively facing. So we understand that what we need to do is a little bit more like going to war than we used to think it was. Like we have to take this seriously. Big things have to be done, and quickly and seriously. So I think that's going to call forth a new appreciation for leadership.
Yeah, I agree. It would be very important, and the reason why I feel so strongly about that is that I feel like leadership allows you to focus. Again, we are back to the first quality, to focus energy towards a direction, and if it's only the saving of the world. And I do think we need more leaders that actually dare to take these roles bravely and guide other people and help other people to become leaders too. Again, ideally, we all would take these leadership roles in different situations, wherever we stand.
I think everybody feels in themselves that they need to be better at that, in any of the areas of their life.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are probably, like you were talking at the beginning about separating. I believe in what leadership is, not necessarily in calling it leadership, because, for the last half of the 20th century, Orange Commercial Society has been having leadership seminars and leadership courses and trying to teach owners and CEOs and managers different ways of essentially persuading other people. And we've seen them lead us to basically the end of the world. So we're rightly very suspicious of a lot of that upper echelon social leadership dogma. So I think we need to learn to separate those basic, authentic, ancient virtues of leadership that can still go forward from the commercial, corporate, bureaucratic bad name that leadership has got. I don't think leadership's bad name is just because Green disapproves of hierarchy. I think a lot of it is because a lot of the leaders we've seen were not actually doing their job. We've seen a lot of senators and presidents and university presidents. They're not doing their jobs. They're not providing leadership, and they're not being real authorities. And we've gotten used to the fact that our authorities have no authority. So it makes us very suspicious about authority in general. But if we saw more examples of real leaders, I think we would get a different flavor.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And we still see too many leaders that are disappointing, that are where we don't feel like, oh yeah, they have the big picture and they have actually something I wanna lean into, I want to be part of, I can sign off. And even, I find it kind of interesting, even in this very polarized world that we are having, not even in the polls, I see these big leaders that are actually capable to lead even the polarized movement. It's kind of, there is such a leadership vacuum everywhere. And I wonder where this will lead, and what needs to happen to crash that vacuum. Because what also would probably not be ideal is when one person kind of pops up and everybody runs after him or her, and that would create the same not so good dynamics that we had before. For me, it's more like a system of leaders that actually learn to live all these qualities that we were talking about, and work with each other in this spirit of these qualities to bring something forward.
I'm very curious, and I think it's a good thought experiment to wonder, like, let's say you had a bureaucracy or a corporation or a government, and it has certain ways of doing things. If you kept all of the same people and changed the protocols, or if you changed the spirit of the people, if they were much more anchored in a second-tier version of leadership, but you kept the same procedures, what would those two different outcomes look like? To what degree do our behavioral protocols lead us? And to what degree do our insides and our shared mood lead us? And I think we need both, but it's kind of uncertain which one's the most important in any given situation, because you could say you could have the best president in the world, but if we still do our voting the same way, if we still have the same administrative layout, we're going to get the same kinds of decisions no matter how good our leader is.
Yes. That's a very interesting question. I would totally agree with you when we just have the president as the one that has this great leadership skills. But your original question was a little bit different. You were asking if we would change the whole leadership team into real second-tier leaders and leave the procedures. And when you were there with your question, I was very clear in myself that I would prefer that I do think I would rather have people with second-tier consciousness and these qualities guiding, leading an organization with the old procedures because they would do it differently. The way they would act and would influence other people and would interact with the other people inside the same procedure and rule set would be different. Whereas if you change the rule set, but not the mindset, not the consciousness of the people that are on top, that just doesn't work. They will corrupt the new system as much as they have corrupted the old system. So I would say people before, like
that's what we were saying earlier with who.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have to have the right people.
I'm curious about, let's say, feedback loops, or I don't know if you've read Nassim Taleb, but he talks about skin in the game as you know, you have to have something at stake in a procedure in order to be good at being a participant in making decisions about that procedure. So you could have, if you've never been to Afghanistan and your children aren't in the army, it's going to be very difficult for you to make a smart decision about Afghanistan, no matter how well informed you are, and no matter what other virtues you have. The decision doesn't directly affect you, and there'll be a layer at which you're not smart about it because it doesn't affect you personally. Like if you put people who don't use phones in charge of the phones, they're going to make some bad decisions just because it doesn't matter to them in a very personal, visceral way.
Yeah, it's a famous question, and it's actually a question that is not only a second-tier question. It's a question that in Orange organizations was asked a lot, because it's basically the question: can you manage an entity without having any knowledge about what is being done in that entity? It's this question, and interestingly enough, I have done it. I have actually managed myself an entity that I had no idea what they were actually doing, and it worked, and it always made me not comfortable. I wasn't comfortable in that role. So I'm totally in favor of having the skin in the game and actually having leaders and managers that come from the base up and know what it is about and how it is and how it works, and have at least an idea of what their team is confronted with and what they do. But I can see the other end too, because what you do when you are thrown into a situation where you don't have skin in the game, where you have literally no idea, and you just have to manage the whole process, what this gives you is a lot of objectivity, and you see the failures of the system much clearer than you do when you have too much skin in the game. Right. It's kind of an interesting experience when you're totally baby in what these guys are doing. When you don't have skin in the game, it can help you to be more objective about the situation.
So there's a balance point there.
My leaning is towards having skin in the game. I feel more comfortable. If I would have to choose one, I would always choose the one where one would have skin in the game.
I'm very curious about decision-making processes and pondering. So if I imagine a second-tier leader and a situation comes up and there's choices to be made, and they're going to face everything, and they're also going to check in with their more or less conscious feeling of what evolution's intention is in that context.
Yeah.
But then what do? How do they, what's a good second-tier strategy for juggling options, adjudicating choices, pondering to the point where you feel comfortable about a decision? Because I think that's a really uninspected process. We often just say someone made a decision, and we don't think about what it was that they did between their options in order to get to a place where they were comfortable gambling on that choice.
Mm-hmm. So for me, it was always about gathering information from the people I trust. Back to, I want to have a team of people I trust so that I can gather information that help me to make the decisions that I have to make. And that gives you the rational access to the decision making. And then, and that I think is something that comes in with 2nd-Tier, and for sure on the turquoise level, you also want to trust your intuition. You want to have all the rational facts, and you want to be brave enough also to go with your intuition. And like the reintroduction of gut feeling and intuition, which isn't present in orange. In orange, it has all to be either financial based or fact based or scientific based. I do think in 2nd-Tier, intuition gets valued more deeply again. And a good leader for me has a good intuition because he is connected to his authenticity, to the positivity of life, like everything that is beyond just the mind and the rationality. And if we have access to that part, we should be brave enough and take responsibility also for making decisions that probably cannot always be proven on paper why exactly this decision is the right one. But that's a risk. I mean, this is a risky path.
Some people say there's a risk in having excess homogeneity, right? There's a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, and one of the things it talks about is if you get a bunch of experts and you ask them their opinion and you sort of add up that opinion, you get a certain answer. But if you send them all to a conference together for the weekend, their collective decision gets dumber because they became more like each other. They have more of a consensus. They flattened out their differences. And so their overall understanding is less. But you could help correct that if you just added a random person into the mix, because the formal element of diversity sometimes makes a structure or a team smarter. So what do you think is, from the 2nd-Tier leadership point of view, what's the leader's responsibility in trying to make sure a group isn't too much the same, isn't too much on the same page, doesn't agree with each other or look like each other too much?
Yeah, that's a very important point. And one way to do it is that you consciously choose like different types of people. Like when we go into typology, be it Enneagram types, be it whatever typology you want to look at, and really consciously force yourself to hire different types, and especially also hire people that are different than you are, because one has a tendency to hire people where you have a quick sympathy and the good rapport and the good feeling with each other. And if you only hire like this, that will create these homogeneous groups with similar people that get along really well with each other, but have their blind spots because they tick so similarly. So in the end, you would have to, or you have to force yourself to hire counterpoints, or and that's something that I regularly did, you invite other people into strategy meetings, into big management decisions, and you invite other people, like completely unrelated people, told them the story, what this was all about, and have them ask questions about the decision, about what is going to happen. And it's amazing what comes out, how quickly people that have no idea about the whole thing actually catch up with you and ask the right question and challenge you in your decision making or in your thought process and bring in new ideas.
Another thing that interests me is the role of a 2nd-Tier leader in clarifying the mission, like not just being very strongly aligned with the intention, but being able to articulate it in a way that it can be distributed. Because I heard a lecture from an American general, General Mattis, who was temporarily the Secretary of Defense, and he was very concerned about the lag time in the military hierarchy, right? That if someone's coming up to the gate of the base with a bomb, the local commander needs to make a decision. He can't radio, and it goes up to the Secretary of Defense and goes up to the president and then comes back. That's too late. So how do we make it such that a local commander is trustworthy to make up his own mind? He has to really be clear about what the mission is. The mission has to be phrased in a way that the greatest number of people can understand what it is so that we can trust them to make their own decision about how to accomplish it. So it seems like the leader has a huge task in terms of clarifying the mission to the point that it could be distributed to everyone.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's probably one of the most difficult tasks that the leader has. It's very interesting. I was working in quite a few bigger companies where we did employee surveys every year. And I can speak of about 5 companies. One was a big American company, the other were Swiss companies with between 200 and 6,000 employees. And each and every of these employee surveys always had the weakest point in communication. And this was also true in companies where I felt we as management did our very best to transparently communicate as much as you can. And still the perception, and that's an interesting aspect of this, the perception of the employees and team members often was, they probably don't tell us everything. And this is kind of interesting also when you look into the whole suspicion today in the world towards them up there, like this suspicion that they up there hide things or don't tell us the full truth. And this is something that you really can see in organizations. So I think communication is just a very, very difficult task. And I have not yet completely cracked how to best do it. I mean, you can do town halls, you can communicate in written, you can put out your vision, you can have all these vision charts in each office, and still you don't fully accomplish what you just described.
Communication, it's very tricky in hierarchical situations, right? That obviously we need some kind of leadership hierarchies of various kinds to form the skeleton of our organizations. But my favorite author when I was a kid was an American science fiction writer named Robert Anton Wilson. And he introduced me to a lot of very expansive thinkers. And he had something he talked about what he called Salin's Law, named after a character in one of his novels. And it was the idea that you can't really have communication unless people feel equal. Because if there's a person who has the ability to reward or punish you, if your financial or status well-being depends on someone, you have no choice but to filter the information you give them, because the most important thing to you is getting a positive rather than a negative outcome. And that means at each level of the hierarchy, the amount of information coming up from the bottom is being reduced to the point where the person at the top is the least informed about the real situation, because everyone knows to not trust everyone above them. So how do you juggle having a leadership hierarchy that works and the danger of everybody's going to lie to someone if that person has power over them?
Yeah, I mean, that is why trust and trustworthiness is so important. When I am trustworthy as the leader, and that's true for all these hierarchical levels that you are describing, if you can create an organization where every leader is actually trustworthy and trusts his employees, his team members, then that is a big step into a better direction than what you just described. Because what you have to get out of the system is this suspicion that I could be punished, or that I cannot admit a mistake, as we said before. So these deliberately developmental organizations that put out everything transparently on all levels, top down and bottom up, create this kind of trust that is needed for this to work. But it takes a lot. I mean, this is still theory. I don't think that there are many companies that actually do that. I just don't think so, because it's from the point of view of human nature, it's so difficult to do it. It's difficult to trust. It's difficult to be trustworthy. Yeah, but then I wanted to add something else to this whole discussion about communication, and I want to ask you a question back. Do you think it's always the best idea to share everything with everybody?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. That's what I thought.
But I think we
And
can. I think we can tease that apart from, the different ideas about power. Right. One is power over someone. Right. And if they are dependent upon pleasing you or not upsetting you, that creates a certain dynamic. If you can avoid that dynamic, or like you say, if you can demonstrate that you're trustworthy sort of apart from that dynamic, then that's really good. At the same time, that doesn't mean all information and all status in all situations should be treated as equal. That clearly is not functional. And there are lots of reasons. There are lots of places where we have too much transparency, just like there's lots of places where we don't have nearly enough transparency.
Yeah, and that leads us again back to what we talked about before, that you also have to honor the different levels of development, and even in an organization, and that not all information can be shared because not everybody would understand what this information means, could read it correctly, could interpret it correctly. Not every decision that is made on a board level should be transparently communicated in this, because it's not always easy to be understood by everybody. But that's tricky too, because you also don't want to create these silos of decision making, and nobody knows why decisions are being made.
The notion of distributing autonomy that's featured in holacracy, it feeds into this, right? Because one really good example of where we don't want there to be too much open communication is in voting. We have secret ballots. Because we know that if other people know how you're voting, your brain will automatically take that into account, and you won't vote what you really think. You'll vote what we think will work best for you socially in the future.
Exactly.
So we have to have that information not be transparent to the people around you. Right. And then you go, well, why isn't there secret ballot in the legislatures then? Why isn't there secret ballots in the boardroom? Where those are situations where we tend to allow the social circumstance to override someone's private autonomy of decision, because we all want to see each other's decisions. So there may be too much transparency in some of those situations as well.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I agree. And ideally, if we look at the utopian idea of what we were talking about this ideal leadership, if the transparency would be high enough and the autonomy of each and everybody involved, then you would not have to have secret votes, because everybody would be stable in him and herself, so that we would take the authentic decision anyway. Yeah.
In 1,000 years, when we're ready to implement that system. In the meantime, there's some really tricky things. Like I don't want to undervalue the sophistication of the Chinese system, because it's usually, we can be a little bit pejorative about what China's doing. But there is a sense in which they're a little bit strong-handed, a little bit authoritarian. They don't respect as many of the modern virtues as we would like. Yeah. However, I'm in Canada, and we get a pandemic, and we go, well, everybody's got to stay home because the hospitals will get overwhelmed, which is true. Yeah. But the Chinese start building 100 new hospitals a week, right? Exactly. And so you're like, well, why can't we do that? Are they more effective because they're operating from what we think is a lower level? And then by extension, can second-tier leadership and second-tier organizations outcompete first-tier organizations or not?
Yeah, I don't know yet. I don't think that there are many second-tier companies. Even so, I'm always a little bit confused. I'm sure you know Said Davlabani and his mnemonics, and he positions many of the big companies like Amazon and Google and these big guys as second-tier companies. And I understand he does this because systemic, they really are world-centric companies, and they, he makes that argument. But inside, in terms of leadership and in terms of how they are managed, I questioned. I can see that the business model is probably a second-tier business model, but I'm absolutely not sure, or pretty sure, that it's not a second-tier model in terms of management of these companies, which are two different things. And I just don't know many companies I would call second-tier companies in terms of their management. I mean, there is this famous home care company in Holland that Lalou describes, and that's a beautiful description of a second-tier company. But it's very isolated. It's almost like this black sheep, or the white sheep in all the black sheeps. But it has not yet sized up. All these models have not sized yet. And even holocracy, some companies that have started to do it, bigger companies have stopped it again and didn't continue.
Yeah, we just don't have the data yet. I mean, we've barely started to experiment with socialist cooperatives, which is hundreds of years old, that idea already. So we haven't been very experimental, so we don't have very much data.
Yeah, no, we don't. And even I think even like a small, tiny organization, as we try to build with Manifest Nirvana, when you start to have team members and more people joining, and then you are faced with all the managerial challenges of salary and finances, and how you lead people, how you make them responsible for what they are doing. It's in a heartbeat where you are in the middle of orange thinking, in a way that you would like to do from a second-tier perspective, but it's not as simple as that.
What do you think about choices of allies and choices of people to work with? Because there's a lot of social discussion around, well, this group of people or this person is problematic and we don't want to be associated with them. To what degree does a second-tier leader need to, police our associates, and keep us clean and away from people who are bad? And to what degree does the leader have to say, that's not what's important? We're going to work with whoever helps us get our job done, regardless of how it makes us feel?
Ooh, that's a very loaded question. I don't know. Because like my first response is, my first response is, I wouldn't want to work with people where there is not a connection, where I don't feel, I always did and still do believe that when you have partners, be that vendors or partners in a project, you need to be able to connect like on a human level. I never felt it should be just a transaction. I do believe that this is very important. So in that sense, I would lean towards saying, yeah, you kind of have to be able to relate to the people you work with. But then, and that's even more my rational mind thinking about second-tier and second-tier leadership also realizes, but we have to have diversity. We have to be able to open up. We have to force ourselves to connect to more people that we naturally would want to connect to. But it's like this feeling inside of me where I feel almost overwhelmed and say, yeah, but I want to be able to choose who I work with. At least that I would like to do. But I can see that we probably have to cultivate both. And I'm obviously totally against all flavors of cancel culture, because somebody has done something somewhere in the past or present or whatever. We have to look broader than just into single acts of stupidness or silliness or whatever.
Yeah, it's tricky to try to figure out how to legitimately hold people to account for things, even things that we might not previously have thought were that problematic. but also not to demonize anyone or take away the
Yeah,
idea that there's growth or be hyper reactive to anything that reminds us of problems. So how to
yeah,
do all of that together gracefully, I'm not sure anyone's
exactly.
figured that out yet.
No, absolutely not. I haven't seen it, but it would be important, and it's part of what I would see as a second tier mindset. Like when we develop this capacity to hold more complexity, this needs to be part of it. No, we cannot. Yeah, we have to actually be able to hold that complexity of situations and of people's personalities and everything that comes with it.
I feel like we're coming near to the end. Is there
Mhm.
anything else, in the back of your mind that you wanted to get into or address or that's coming up for you?
No, I think we covered it beautifully.
All
It
right
was
then. Well,
very inspiring. Thank you so much.
it's a pleasure to talk with you as always. I love
Thank you.
how open you are and how much thought you've put into these things and how easily you go into all these different dimensions and take the conundrums seriously. So thank
Mhm,
you very
mhm.
much, Daniela.
Thank you, Layman. Thank you.